So, yeah, is the mic okay? Yeah. Firstly, just a huge thank you. When you operate primarily in the online world, it's difficult to kind of get to grips with who's really reading, and it's difficult to make sense of the numbers, even when they're small or large. It's hard to know what kind of an impact you're making, and so to be put in a room like this with accomplished folks like this, it's quite it sort of hits home. So thank you. Just sort of following on from kind of what other people have said tonight, I think it's really interesting to choose new media this year, and this year especially, because I think we're sort of at quite a unique junction in history in terms of the individual, I suppose, the sort of either someone like me who's just writing about history or culture, or someone who's sort of making more of an impact on the ground, like a citizen journalist of sorts, to make an impact over the sort of established media landscape. And this year, or maybe last year even, was sort of quite a critical juncture. My platform that I primarily publish on is Twitter, which is now X, as you will probably, most of you know, acquired by Elon Musk in a sort of quite dramatic series of events. And I think that's a no small part in the story, in terms of the sort of man with a camera being able to pull more views than a traditional news network. And that is a sort of strange thing to deal with, and in some ways it's not that new. It's sort of been happening for the last 10 years. But from my perspective, the Elon Musk situation is one whereby it's sort of, for the first time, not being policed in a way that is politically biased. He's sort of opened the floor for everyone to come and speak. And so that is new at the sort of scale that it's now being introduced. And so that means that sort of small and large accounts, with a mission like ours and my friends over here, we can kind of see that our ideas are kind of falling more to the free market in terms of whether or not they filter to the top. And it's certainly not. I come from Britain. I certainly wouldn't say that it's the BBC's intention to celebrate the beauty and the goodness of the Western tradition, but it doesn't really matter anymore whether they omit stuff or don't omit it. It's sort of irrelevant increasingly in this media landscape. So that's a really interesting sort of place to be in history, and I think it only will sort of go in that direction, and I think we should all be encouraged by that. And I guess I'll sort of just kind of explain the Culture Critic page to those who haven't seen it. It sort of tries to condense in short essays what is beautiful about the past, whether that's in the visual arts or in kind of religious history and that kind of thing. And my primary motivation for starting it was growing up in Britain, where the architecture it's quite dramatic in places, and it's sort of hard to believe almost how much our sort of millennia-old cathedral squares have been sort of degraded. And to the extent that you can only conclude that it was done cynically and deliberately. And that is a sort of notion which is gaining a lot of popularity, and that's sort of why I think I'm here today, because I've sort of got quite popular talking about that kind of thing online. And so now, instead of looking up in a town square like the Gothic arts were inspiring you to do, you now look upwards at a kind of concrete overhang, free of any ornamentation, and that's quite a dramatic thing. And that's kind of one of the kind of topics that I think that I would sort of try to bring to light with my writing. And what I'm trying to do is sort of wrap this into Spengler, and I'll get there in a minute. But I find it interesting, in the mid-20th century, when our sort of brutalist public realm was forged. It was preached at the time by the modernists that it's virtuous to sort of shave details and ornaments off buildings and sort of cut costs at every turn. And I think well, you can sort of say that the postmodernists then kind of took things further and turned architecture into a kind of radical form of self-expression at the cost of the public realm. And so those great cities that were handed to us, I think you can kind of differentiate them by seeing that it was a sort of innate understanding by past generations that you don't cut corners in that way, and you build things for the good of the community. Or in other words, that the purpose of building is not to showcase the ego of one architect in particular, but to do something for the good of all, really. And so I think there's something very fundamental in that sense, in that the modernists of the mid-century miss the point that the idea actually of architecture is to sort of commit sacrifice for the community, in the sense that buildings should be costly. And I'm stealing an idea from John Ruskin here, which is that the sort of primary principle of architecture is sacrifice. And buildings should be expensive, and they should be filled with kind of Gothic ornamentation, because that proves that sacrifice went into it. And that's, on a deep level, something that's very different to today. I think that, and if you were to sum up what the Western tradition means in one word, I think you would say sacrifice, and that has its roots, obviously, in the scripture. But I think it ties in well with what my sort of limited understanding of Spengler is, which is to some extent drawing out the importance of the collective culture over the individual ego. When there was a common value set understood by all artists, the great original works from history kind of almost wrote themselves with ease. And so you had Mozart and Bach producing finished works as they did so easily, but also you had 1,000 other artists of the 18th century that would just churn works out like it was almost nothing. And the increasing difficulty, and I'm really sort of paraphrasing from Spengler, the increasing difficulty with which great artworks were produced thereafter was reflective of the unraveling of that coherent whole. So when I first started to read The Decline of the West, I obviously wanted to jump straight into what he had to say about architecture. And there's a really good passage which I'll just read out fully in English, not in German. No one wants to hear that. So the symptom of decline in creative power is the fact that to produce something round and complete, the artist now requires to be emancipated from form and proportion. Its most obvious, though not its most significant manifestation, is the taste for the gigantic. Here size is not, as in the Gothic and the Pyramid styles, the expression of inward greatness, but the dissimulation of its absence. This swaggering in specious dimensions is common to all nascent civilizations. We find it in Zeus, in the Zeus altar of Pergamum, the Colossus of Rhodes, the architecture of the Roman Imperial Age, and even in the American skyscraper of today. But what is far more indicative is the arbitrariness and immoderateness that tramples on and shatters the conventions of centuries. He then goes on to say that the destiny of the form lay in the race or the school, not in the private tendencies of the individual. So I think he's making the case, more generally, that the expressions of a civilization at its nascent stage are the results of a form of a coherent whole in some sense. And that the way to judge the architecture of modernity is to see it as insensitive to the conventions that came before, and that the individual's ambition has sort of risen above the values that once bound the society in a kind of collective organism. And that idea, I think, is sort of starting to become recognized in popular culture, and you see it in the sort of popularity of my friends at Thinking West and hopefully my own, that there is a sort of pushback against this and a recognition of that is the problem. And I think that the more kind of, liberated the media landscape becomes, the more that fact can sort of be recognized and filtered to the top. I'm sure you wouldn't have heard a rant like that on any of the kind of established media outlets, for maybe good reason. So I think looking at history in this way is really interesting, and so I just want to thank the Society for your commitment to keeping alive philosophy of history in that way, and to continue to advance the ideas of Spengler. I think it's great work. I think my mission is sort of less impressive and ambitious, but similar in that I want to sort of keep alive the great history of the Western visual arts and try to understand try to understand the type of society that made it in the first place. So those are my comments. Thank you.